Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the manager of academic programs and public outreach at JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar in the context of the David and Ruth Mosher JDC Archives Fellowship. I'd like to start by saying a few words about JDC Archives. JDC Archives holds the records of the JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, since the organization's creation over 100 years ago. Scholars from around the world, as well as filmmakers, family researchers, journalists, and others use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. And one of these fellowships is the David and Ruth Mosher JDC Archives Fellowship. It was established thanks to a generous gift from David and Ruth Mosher, who are supporters of JDC with the deep roots in the American Jewish community, as well as a long-time commitment to Jewish education and academic research and scholarship. I want to extend our thanks to David and Ruth Mosher, who are with us today, for their generosity in endowing this fellowship. Our speaker today, Yair Wallach, is the recipient of the David and Ruth Mosher JDC Archives Fellowship for 2022. He's a reader in Israeli studies and the head for the Center for Jewish Studies at SOAS, the University of London. Yair has written primarily on urban and material culture in modern Palestine, Israel. His first book, City in Fragments, Urban Text in Modern Jerusalem, was published by Stanford University Press in 2020, and it won the 2022 Jordan Schnitzer Prize. His current work focuses on the questions of migrations and race, particularly the integration and acculturation of Ashkenazim in Arab society and culture in Eastern Mediterranean. And his presentation today is linked to that research topic. The title of his lecture is Rethinking Ashkenazi History in the Modern Middle East, Early 20th Century, Egypt and Palestine. Yair's presentation will last about 45 minutes. This will be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A. Please note that your microphones are muted. You can send us questions via the Q&A function on Zoom, and you can send us questions at any time during the lecture. Yair will now start his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to give the lecture, and I'm also very grateful for the fellowship to the JDC and the donors. So I'd like to start. I'll share my presentation now. And here it is. So the topic today, I'm going to talk about my research in general, in the sense of my project of rethinking the history of the modern history of Ashkenazim in the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and specifically in Palestine and Egypt, as a form of migration rather than through the ideological way it's usually constructed. And I'm going to do this primarily through the episode of the story of refugees from Palestine, from Jaffa and Jerusalem and elsewhere, that came from Palestine to Egypt during World War I and were there during the war, and how to understand this story using the JDC archives and other archives, as you shall see. So first thing to say is that, and I think this is probably known to some of you, is that the Joint Distribution Committee starts the catalyst for its establishment is the question of the crisis of Jews in Palestine during World War One. So that's the famous Henry Morgenthau's telegram from Istanbul to New York saying there's a terrible crisis in Palestine because Palestine is cut off from France and Britain and Russia because of the war, and that threatens the colonies and it threatens the other communities there, and therefore he sought help from American Jews, and that was the catalyst to kind of establishing the joint. And I think it's really, really interesting because this is a relatively small community, at the time. And if you look at what the joint did during the war, also this very quickly became a minor story relatively. So if you look at how much money the JDC spent on Palestine, that's about 15% of the money they spent during the war, so about $2 million out of $14 million dollars. Most money goes to Russia and Poland and so forth, where most of the suffering is, and of course the numbers are much bigger. But I think it's interesting that it's Palestine and the symbolic role of Palestine, which has the power to galvanize action, to get people, to convey the urgency of the war and the situation it created for Jewish communities in various places. To start, you need to start with Palestine. And it reminds me the wonderful book by Matthias Lehmann, Emissaries from the Holy Land, which deals with the 18th century, a very different period. But again, he talks about money raising for Jewish community in Palestine as the kind of catalyst to create these global networks of charity, modern global networks of charity, and to build up a sense of a global Jewish world in a way that didn't exist before. And what was there primarily Sephardic enterprise, here becomes a primarily Ashkenazi enterprise, and it's that power to capture the imagination, which is so important, but at the same time comes with a lot of perceptions, and often false perceptions about what these communities actually were and what their predicament were and so forth. I should say that the story that I'm going to discuss, the refugees in Alexandria, took a very minor role. It's about 0.3% of the money that the JDC spent during the war. So it's not a major story. So to talk about these false perceptions, they were false there, and in many ways they remain. There's a lot of misleading perceptions that are certainly in popular imagination of what the Jews in Palestine were around the early 20th century, but it's also true a lot of it in the historiography. And I should say it's really interesting because these perceptions are shared among Zionists and anti-Zionists, a lot of these kind of common perceptions. So the kind of common understanding is that Jews in Palestine were divided into two groups. One is the new Yishuv, which is the Zionist immigrants which came, say, from the 1880s, from Eastern Central Europe, and they're modern pioneers, they're organized, and they are, secular or more secular, and so forth. And this is the new Yishuv, the new kind of settlement. And they are contrasted with the old Yishuv. That is mainly people that came there before the 1880s. And these are old people. They came to die in the Holy Land. They came to study. They live on the charity of diaspora communities, and non-productive, often reactionary, of course, Orthodox, live this kind of segregated ghettos and are kind of, that's the kind of common perception of these, and they're often relegated into this kind of marginal, as something that had to be replaced by the new issue. There's so many wrong things about this characterization. Of course, there's some kernels there that are correct, but there's so many wrong things that, some of them we see in the research over the last, 20, 30 years. First of all, it's a story that really forgets about Sephardim and the Mizrahim, however we call them, the kind of the local Jews of the Ottoman Empire, that of course most Jews, overwhelming share of Jews in the Ottoman Empire were not from Eastern Europe. They were Arabic speaking or Ladino speaking. And it's true that in the 19th century, in Palestine, they become a minority, but still a substantial minority. And certainly the leadership and the Jewish aristocracy in Palestine during those years were still very much Sephardic families, and they were also, the more influential. So this story between the new Yishuv and the old Yishuv is really a story between Eastern European Jews or Ashkenazim. And that's one thing that, this story is kind of forgets entirely. Okay, one thing is say I'm using the term Ashkenazim, and as a way to refer to both the newcomers that are in the colonies and so forth, and the kind of the more Orthodox. But I think if this is from a report that was prepared for the JDC in 1918 by Siegfried Hoefjen, who was a Dutch Jew who managed the funds that they sent in Palestine because he was a banker there. And now, Hoefjen prepared a glossary in the beginning of the report because he realized a lot of his readers wouldn't really know all the terms. And it's interesting that the first term that he starts with is Ashkenazim. And you can see how he defines Ashkenazim in the slide. It's Orthodox Jews whose ritual and pronunciation of Hebrew follows the Polish-Russian custom. It's a quite peculiar definition that certainly refers only to what we would call Old Yishuv. So only Orthodox Jews. It's about ritual. It's not so much about origin and so forth. It's not how we think today about Ashkenazim. I think today we would call all Jews that come from Central and Eastern Europe generally come from a Yiddish-speaking Jewish diaspora. We would call them Ashkenazim. But if you told Hoefjen at the time that he was Ashkenazi, he would be really perplexed. If you told the JDC executive board members in 1914 that they were Ashkenazim, they also, I think, would be quite perplexed. So that tells you something about the way that these very categories, their meaning is changing historically. And specifically, I think in Palestine, it's the encounter of these people that come from Eastern Europe, their encounter with Arabic-speaking Sephardic Jews, which makes them all into one kind of Jews. I think this is important. So they are one. They're not Hungarians versus Litvaks. They're not, Russians versus Austrians. They're all Ashkenazi, and I think certainly that creates a sense of a common denominator that I don't think existed for them before. Now, one thing to say, and I think it's important part of my project, is that when you talk about all Yishuv, new Yishuv, etc., that kind of suggests that Ashkenazim was a novelty in 19th century or 20th century Middle East, and it's really not the case. The oldest surviving Yiddish letter that we have is from the Cairo Geniza, and it's a letter in Yiddish by a certain Rachel Zussman to her son Moshe in Cairo. She's writing from Jerusalem to Cairo in 1560, Of course, she complains that he's not writing enough. Some things don't change. But that gives you a glimpse that, Ashkenazim circulated in the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Middle Ages, from the 13th, 14th century, very small communities, usually arriving after some catastrophe in Europe, whether it's, the Black Death that saw some Ashkenazim arrive to Palestine, or later various kinds of persecutions and pogroms. But that kind of presence is familiar to Sephardic Jews, to Muslims, to Ottoman authorities from the 15th century onwards. So this is not a novelty. So these communities circulated and have a history in the Middle East. So to imagine them as some kind of completely cut off from their surrounding, a curiosity, it doesn't make sense. Ashkenazim lived in the region for centuries, so they must have developed some kind of relations with their surroundings. Secondly, there's a mistake that people identify anyone that comes after 1880 as part of a Zionist immigration. And here, a very important book by Gur Al-Roi, maybe some of you know his work, An Unpromising Land, and he worked on the migration to Palestine between 1904 to 1914, very detailed archives, and he was able to demonstrate very conclusively that the people that come to Palestine from Eastern and Central Europe are more or less, in demographic terms, not very different from the kind of people that end up in New York or in Western Europe during this time. So in terms of their motivation, in terms of their, age and family makeup, this is very similar groups. And of course, they were among this group, and he looks at about a period where 30,000 people come to Palestine. Of course, among them, there is a minority of, say, 2,000 people who are motivated very clearly by Zionist ideology, and several hundreds of these are, what later became known as pioneers and so forth. But they are a very small minority. They would become Israel's leadership. They would later become much more important. At that time, still, we're talking about a very small minority. So when we think of migration of Jews from Europe to the Middle East, we need to think of it, we need to be aware that at least in some parts, it is just a form of Jewish migration driven by various predicaments, primarily economic hardship, and the need to kind of make your situation better. In my own project, I primarily look at this question of migration through the question of their integration in local society. So to what extent they changed their clothes, changed their diet, picked up the Arabic language, formed kind of business links or political connections. So what I'm able to find, and I can't go into detail, but really quite a lot of stories that are very surprising. I think we think of them as kind of standalone communities that are disconnected from the Arab communities, while in fact, Ashkenazi migrants to the Ottoman Empire, just like Ashkenazi migrants to Argentina, to other places, engage in practices of integration in various ways. And that, for example, involved, joining the Ottoman military during World War I and fighting, and in some cases dying for the Ottoman Empire in the war against Britain and other countries. What is also interesting, and here is that what I'm trying to do is to enlarge the scope of the discussion, because usually when we talk about migration of Jews to the Middle East, we think Palestine, land of Israel, and therefore we think through the story of Zionism, whether we want to or not. But the fact is that there are Ashkenazi Jews also in Istanbul, also in Beirut, even in Baghdad, and certainly in Cairo and Alexandria. So there's thousands of Jews that come to Egypt. Egypt has a booming economy, certainly after the opening of the Suez Canal. So some people arrive there straight to Ismailia and Port Said or Alexandria. Some people go to Palestine and then they look for better economic opportunities. They go to Egypt because that's where you can do business. And the amount of stories, and it's not a huge community, we're talking about thousands of people, maybe 10,000, maybe at the most 20,000 at its height. I find quite extraordinary spectrum of stories that you can see here in this slide. You can see in the middle Simon Arts, who was the owner of a department store in Port Said and a cigarette brand, major cigarette brand in Egypt. You can see him here with the fez as an Oriental gentleman, but the guy was born in Polish Austria, in Galicia. You can see on the left, Charlotte Rosenthal, the Emma Goldman of the East, if you want, who was born in Egypt to an Ashkenazi family who was instrumental in bringing socialism to Egypt, and she was arrested for communism. And on the right, you can see Ashkenazi drug dealers who operated between Palestine and Egypt later in the 20th century and had some kind of local connections. And this is their mugshots by the police in Egypt. So you can see a real spectrum of social horizons, and there's much more I can say. And it's important to say that when we think of Ashkenazi migration to the region, we shouldn't have this tunnel vision only on Palestine. Of course, Palestine had the biggest number of migrants, and it has symbolic value and so forth. But like in any migration, people go around, they go back and forth, and there's a constant flow in the region, and that will become relevant to the next topic. So the question for me is the question, as I said, the question of refugees that are driven out of Palestine with World War I, and are driven into exile in Egypt, primarily in Alexandria. So that's kind of the episode that I wanted to examine, because it's also recorded and captured in the JDC archive, because a lot of the work was done, also the work vis-a-vis Palestine was done through Alexandria. So here we can see an image of these people arriving in boats. This is in early 1915. So first of all, to give the context for this story. First of all, when we look at Jews in Palestine before the war, it's very difficult to have clear numbers, but something around 85,000, estimates vary between 60 and 95, but I think a safe estimate is around 80,000 Jews live in Palestine. Most of them, say 60% or 55%, are Ashkenazim. Some have been there from the 18th century. Some arrived just before the war, so a real spectrum. And many of them held their European citizenships because it gave them various kind of advantages, and there was no urgency to naturalize as Ottoman citizens. When the war starts, and we don't know exactly the numbers, but when the war starts, many of them are Russian citizens. And when the Ottoman Empire joins the war, and the war is, of course, against Russia, the demand is clear that if you're an enemy citizen, that is a French citizen or British citizen or Russian citizen, then either you naturalize and become an Ottoman citizen, or you will be deported. And that's kind of the basic message. But Jews think that they have time to negotiate this, while very suddenly, on the 17th of 1914, on a Thursday, on a Black Thursday, it's known as the Black Thursday, 700 Jews, Russian Jews, are kind of picked up from the streets of Jaffa and kind of thrown onto the boat and kind of pushed, expelled to Alexandria. A real shock. They were not given even any time to pack or to prepare or to appeal or anything. So quite a traumatic event. Now, after that, thousands more follow their route. And so about, within 2 months, another 7,000 refugees arrive. And by the end of 1915, another 4,000 refugees more or less arrive. So we have very detailed numbers of a little more than 11,000 refugees arrive, Jewish refugees arrive from Palestine to Egypt. Now, the dilemma was then, I think for some people, they chose to leave Palestine because they did not want to Ottomanize. They did not want to take on Ottoman citizenship because they knew that this would lead, for example, to conscription and military service. I should say that within Jews in Palestine, there is a very vocal calls for Jews to take on the Ottoman citizenship in order to stay in the country and to fight for the Ottoman Empire, including, for example, by David Ben Gurion. David Ben Gurion himself is expelled from Palestine because the Ottomans don't trust him. They see him as a kind of troublemaker. So although he professes his loyalty to the empire, he's put on a boat to Alexandria, only he doesn't stay there. He continues to the US almost immediately. So these are the people that stay. Now, around 11,000 Jews, that's a very considerable number. Other people also arrive, like Russia, Russian nuns from Palestine, but we're talking about, very small numbers, dozens or hundreds, compared to this group, which was probably the biggest group of refugees in Alexandria at the time. And Alexandria is about 400,000 people at this time. So it's a substantial number. It's not, maybe, I think even in today's term, sudden arrival of 11,000 people is significant. It's about, and certainly 3% of the city. And the Jewish community, we don't have exact numbers, but the Jewish community is something between 15,000 to 20,000 people in Alexandria. That means that suddenly, within a year, there's 50% more Jews in Alexandria, but refugees. So significant issue for the community, which had dealt in the past in waves of refugees that arrived there, but not in such numbers. So a real issue, and the question of where to put them, where to house them, and who takes the burden, in this story. By the end of the war, only around 1,200 remained in the refugee camps. Some had left to other countries, whether including Russia, but also Australia, North America, and elsewhere. Some, as we'll see, settled in Egypt elsewhere and moved to hotels and other places. So there's kind of various routes out of the refugee camps, and we don't have exact information who went where. Now, I'll say something about the scholarship of this story. The the story is well known. I think both in popular memory in Israel as kind of part of the history of Zionism, it's something that people that know some things about history of Zionism would be familiar with. But there it's remembered primarily as a form of exile, especially also when you consider that they've gone to Egypt. So of course, when you think of going to Egypt, of course, that kind of brings to mind the story of Exodus from Egypt and going there on exile and so forth, the biblical story. And so the idea is that you have these Jews, and mostly they thought about as Zionist Jews, they were exiled there and then kept community life in Hebrew and so forth, and then all returned to Palestine at the end of the war. There's, of course, there's an element of truth to that, but that's also, as I'll show, also covers part of the story. It's interesting how little this has been studied by the scholars, by historians. It's very, very interesting because some aspects of Zionist history are studied, enough to have 100 people in some places, a colony for half a year, and you will get, 3 articles about it with incredible detail. In this case, quite a significant episode, a very, very little historical research. The most serious one maybe is by Nurit Guvrin, who wrote about this through Hebrew writing of various people that were there. What's interesting, she's a literary scholar. She's not a historian, and she approaches it through literature. So, and as she says herself, only through these memoirs and diaries and so forth, gives a very limited view. And this is from relatively dated from 1988. More recently is the work of Dario Micoli, who wrote about Jews in Alexandria. And he looked at British sources and community sources, and we get some somewhat fuller picture. But I think there's still much more to find, as I discovered, from this work in the archives. So first of all, to say that, when you look in the archive, you find references to these people as Palestinian refugees, which is quite startling, considering that when we say today Palestinian refugees, of course, we mean a completely different group of people. That's, Palestinian refugees from 1948, whose predicament is still, unresolved. But in those papers there, when they talk about Palestinian refugees, they talk about these Jewish refugees from Palestine that ended up in Alexandria. So what's interesting to find, and what I found in documented, is relatively not discussed. For example, is the fact that the Russian consul in Alexandria, Petrov, took a very active role in receiving them. And again, this is kind of conflicts with what we think about Russian and Tsarist Russia's attitude to Jews and so forth, or the kind of cliche. But we see that the people on the ground often had a much more ambivalent role. In this case, the Russian consul plays a very important role in the initial reception of these people and organizing their arrival, especially the first 700. But he also arranges the sending of apparently hundreds of men to Russia to fight in the war for the Russian military. And on that, I haven't been able to find any more information, but I wonder how many of them survived, what happened to them. And that's kind of interesting how certain stories kind of just disappear and certain others are get much more attention. Luckily for these people, they very soon that became impossible to send them to Russia, so they could stay in Alexandria and not have to go back to fight for the empire from which they escaped themselves, just for some of them, just some years before. The JDC role in funding was relatively limited. I think the support for these refugees come from various sources, including JDC, but also Anglo-Jewish support, local Alexandrian support by local, mainly Sephardic benefactors who donated buildings for the refugees to live in, and other and schools and so forth. And very soon, and also the local authorities, and I'll get to this in a second. There's a local committee that is set up very quickly, and it's very interesting to see. It's made up of some very key Sephardic local Jewish activists who are also businessmen. There's Ashkenazim in Alexandria, and as I said, there were Ashkenazi Jews in Egypt. In this case, there were Ashkenazim that came from Palestine. So, for example, a certain David Yudilevich, who first came to Palestine as a colonist. He was a colonist, he started Rosh Hashanah, but then he's part of the Carmel wine, if you may know them. And then he's sent to Egypt, where he's their commercial rep. And he lives there for 15 years, representing the Carmel wines and selling them and maybe exporting them to other countries. And he has very good connections with the local community. So he's in kind of mediating roles. And you have a lot of people that came more recently, generally more likely to be Zionist. And when I say Zionist, I mean what we call anachronistically First Aliyah, that is people identified with the colonies. Most of these people will become insignificant later on in the Mandate era and so forth, when people like Ben Gurion becomes the main leadership of the community. But that's another story. Now, very interesting document that I was able to find in the JDC archive is this report prepared by the Egyptian authorities. And of course, at this point, you have to remember that Egypt is ruled by Britain, but still there's quite a high level of local Egyptian involvement and the administration. The governor of Alexandria is Egyptian, and other officials. So, and they are also very involved. And when you look at this document, you see what often Jewish sources don't really tell us, is how much the reception and the management of the refugees is kind of mediated and managed and administrated by the authorities. Again, not so surprising, 11,000 refugees arrive. Of course, the authorities are going to be interested. Of course, they're going to try to manage this as much as they can. But somehow, in the history, their role is kind of being marginalized. Through this, we can get a sense also of who these people were. And again, I think if we read the literature, we get the sense that these are only Russian Jews or Jews with a Russian passport. But you can see here, and this refers to refugees in the government camp and in February 1915. So some people already were not in the camps. So that's doesn't give us a complete picture. And of course, I mentioned, this is, less than half of 11,000. But it gives us an idea about the diversity of citizenships. You can see that half the people are, have a Russian passport, but around a third, or 30%, so that's more than 1,000 people, have a French passport. This means that, most likely these are North African Jews rather than Ashkenazi Jews who also decided not to Ottomanize. In some cases, they were, put on the boat, whether they wanted to or not. Or in some cases, they chose to leave Palestine because it was safer. We know about such cases anecdotally. Example, the Shlush family. I found a story about how they sent their kids to Alexandria. They had French citizenship because they were North African Jews who came to Palestine from, North Africa. So I guess there were many more of them. So we're talking about quite a few who are not Ashkenazi. So that's one interesting thing. We saw also British, Spanish, American and British were more likely Ashkenazi Jews. So this gives you a sense that this is a more heterogeneous experience than others. Okay, I go very briefly. We know that there's organized very kind of to various refugee sites according to nationality and gender. As I mentioned, involvement of the government and local municipality, for example, and local Egyptians. A baker that donated, I think his premises for them to work in. There's an attempt to make them work in sewing workshops. Again, they do this alongside Egyptian women, which is interesting, or in a local patisserie. All this for the used for the war effort. There's also reference for some kind of riots in March, April 15. It's not. This document doesn't say anything why the riots happened. In Mikoli's article, I find references to a scandal about matzos. Matzot, they were sent to Alexandria by the JDC and then taken by the local Jewish community, is not given to refugees. Maybe that's the reason for the riot. I don't know. Now, I think I want to give you a sense of how kind of there's different perspectives on these refugees. And here you can see a quote from Vladimir Zhabotinsky, the leader of revisionism, who was in Alexandria as a journalist, and talk about these refugees, 6,000 people, in very terrible terms. He says, the scene is increasingly unpleasant. Out of 6,000 refugees, I doubt if there are 1,000 civilized people. The rest are the people of the Halukah, the Schnorr, the people that lived on charity, which are the worst. Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, they all Schnorr, and many of them are thieves. When they sailed on the Tennessee, the American ship that brought them, they managed to steal some benches from the ship. This scum is putting us to shame. This is in a private letter, incredibly harsh and quite miserable people that were thrown out of their home. But that kind of reflects often very judgmental Zionist attitudes towards local Jews in Palestine, which they call pejoratively the old Yishuv. Zhabotinsky, what he was mainly interested is to recruit these people to fight for the British military in Gallipoli. That's the famous Zion Mule Battalion, and with some success, some hundreds did join the military, that group, under the command of someone you may know. This is Joseph Trumpeldor. You can see here sitting on the bottom on the right with his tie, kind of this war hero from Tsarist Russia who lost his arm and then later died in Palestine in 1920. So he was involved in this attempt to get them to fight for the British against the Ottomans. Not hugely successfully, several hundreds volunteered, but again, very, very, you could look at his letters, he has very harsh words about them. They complain all the time, they want to go to Alexandria all the time. But that's usually the stories that remain in popular memory about these these exiles are usually around this Zion Mule Corps or other kind of Zionist activities. I want to end with a number of stories that of people who don't really fit this story and kind of suggest other trajectories and narratives. So this is, first of all, this is his friends in Alexandria. This is a family that arrived, also Wechsler family, arrived again as exile, but because they were middle class, they didn't stay in the refugee camp. You can see here in the Ibermia neighborhood, probably found some nice house to rent. They were Ashkenazim. The woman standing in the middle was his fiancée of Trumpeldor for a while. Ashkenazim, but very interesting story. The father was a representative of a petroleum company in Beirut for several years. The small daughter that you can see on the bottom, Sarah Miriam, she is called after her grandmother that died in Alexandria. So you have already third generation of Ashkenazim in the region. She was born in Beirut. They come to Alexandria. So you get a sense that there's kind of movement in the region, as I said, that are not solely focused on Palestine. She herself, by the way, ended up in France after the war, and then migrated to Palestine and later Israel. Another example is Zalman Barav, who was an Ashkenazi Jew from Jerusalem, Orthodox Jew, and he, unlike many of the refugees, went back to Palestine in 1918, stayed in Alexandria, opened a hotel, the Jerusalem Hotel. You can see this rather hipsterish, postcard advert of the hotel in Hebrew, Yiddish, Arabic, Russian, any kind of language that you want. He stayed there until 1928, and then he moved his hotel to Jerusalem. Hotel Jerusalem moved to Jerusalem, and he stayed there. So this is kind of one example. People just decided to stay. Maybe the most interesting is the Frankel brothers. Again, you can see the father, Bezalel Frankel. He came from, I think, in the just before the war, or around 1910, to Jaffa, had a print shop. All the family become refugees in Alexandria, but he stayed on. He had a furniture shop, according to some accounts, but he also had a print shop. They moved to Cairo. What's interesting about that his sons, Hirsch, and Shlomo and David, they opened the Frankel Brothers, which was the first animation studio in Egypt, making short animation films in the 30s and 40s called Mishmish Effendi. There's a wonderful film about this family, and it's amazing story. You can even find the animation on YouTube if you want. Kind of copy of Walt Disney in Arabic, including some very patriotic Egyptian film. The family was kicked out of Egypt in 1950, probably because they didn't manage to get Egyptian citizenship. And one of the interesting things I found, just looking at the history, this is from the UN archive, Bezalel, the father, writing to them in 26, begging them from some kind of UN passport instead of his Tsarist Russian passport, which is useless by this point. And the UN says, no, we can't help you. There's so many requests. You just have to apply for Egyptian ID when you can. Probably didn't work. And the more moving thing is this postcard he sent, and there's dozens of these postcards he sent to Poland in the early years of World War II, to libraries that he worked for, trying to get, so he probably sent them material or worked with them, and he tried to make contact during World War II, and these postcards were returned to Egypt. And I think you can get a sense suddenly that the Ashkenazi story, which includes, the story of exile, diaspora, migration, suddenly Egypt is part in the story in an unfamiliar way. And tragically, I think for them, for his family, which was very, very interested to stay in Egypt, they were saved from the Holocaust by staying there, but kicked out of after 1950 because of, the Arab-Israeli conflict and so forth. I want to end here by saying what we can get a sense from these stories. First is that Ashkenazim migrated to and lived in the Eastern Mediterranean in many forms. So clearly there is a Zionist story. There are also those who came out of pious motivations. There are those who came to die in Palestine. That's also true. But there are also many others that came for other reasons. And maybe they had positive sentiment towards Zionism or not, but that's not their own story. So, and they didn't come just to Palestine, and there are kind of various stories that get lost if we just focus on the story of Zionism. So what I'm trying to do is to move beyond the tunnel vision on Palestine and Israel, think of them as not necessarily different from normal migrations, and a way to think of Ashkenazi history as part of Middle Eastern history, as part of that. While I also would say that it's really interesting work on this, how you really need to combine different archives to get the fuller picture, because the JDC archives give very good kind of top level view of these kind of reports, numbers, etc. To get the kind of family stories, I need to go to other kind of other archives, photo archives, UN archives, Yad Vashem, and so forth. And luckily for us, we can combine all these today, often without moving from our desk, just online, whether it's a JDC or Yad Vashem and elsewhere. And that's a really amazing development. And I'll end here. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Yair, for a fascinating talk. I think we've all learned so much today. And we'll open the floor to questions. Please remember to send them via the Q&A function. And we'll ask as many as possible. If we don't ask your question, we will make sure that we send it to Yair after the webinar. So Yair, I see that we have a question from Michal Ben Yaakov. Hi, Michal. So although the focus is on the Ashkenazi refugees, did you find anything in the JDC archives other than that report which you shared with us on the 100 of North African Jews with French citizenship? Did the JDC offer them aid as well? Or do you think that they might have been helped by the local Sephardi and Maghrebian communities?
So in this, I would say this. What I became clear when I was working is that for the JDC, I think that's the modus operandi. They find the local community to work with. They're very pragmatic. They're a non-Zionist organization. They will work with the Zionists. They work with non-Zionists. They're very, very pragmatic. They want to help people. And they find the people that they can trust locally and they work with, and then they give them the money. They make sure that everything is legit, but they don't go into this kind of micromanagement. And they don't want to deal with the refugees themselves, at least in Alexandria. I think probably also in other. That's why for the micro stories, I could find very, very little references. So I think we would need to look elsewhere. I think it would make sense. So there's a reference to Abu Jadid, for example, Sephardic doctor from Jerusalem who worked as a doctor in the refugee camps. So that's kind of one reference of the Sephardic or Maghreb North African role in the camps. But we would need to understand how this dynamic worked. We would really need to look elsewhere because, until now, the limited literature has said nothing about this. you also ask about the Shlush family. It's true that most of the Shlush family stayed in Jaffa, but at least one, I think two of the sons, Yosef Eliyahu sends to Egypt. At first, he thinks he Ottomanizes them, so he applies for an Ottoman passport for them, and then he has a change of heart, and he thinks this is too dangerous. I want him to use the French passport to go to Alexandria. And it's in his memoirs, it's quite, this almost this kind of thriller where they break into some building and to erase their name from the list so they can go on the boat, they can go to Alexandria. But as you say, most of the family stayed in Palestine. And what I can say more generally, it seems that the condition of refugees in Alexandria were very good relatively. So certainly better than condition of Jews in Palestine, where there's poverty, in some cases expulsion from Jaffa and other places, and poverty and disease. The situation of refugees in Alexandria, it's not, they're still refugees, but it's relatively, from the accounts we have, is very reasonable. So those, at least materially, were lucky.
Yair, I see we have a question from Michael Rom. Hi, Michael. We have all those former fellows of JDC Archives on this call, and it's so nice to not see them, but read their questions. What percentage of these refugees do you think remained in Egypt after World War I?
It's almost impossible to tell, I think, at least for me now. There may be. What I know is that after the war, or kind of in the 20s, the numbers I saw for the Alexandrian community is around 25,000, which means that probably a few thousand stayed in the country. But whether it's 2,000 or 3,000, I can't tell. What I know is that initially, when people went in 1914, 1915, some people in Palestine were worried that they were not going to come back because Egypt was considered, a relatively well-off country where you can succeed economically. And so especially Zionists like Menachem Usishkin said, this is like in a biblical story that you go to Egypt because it's a rich country. They were worried that all of these people would go and come and never come back. In reality, refugees, if they're given the choice, they usually come back, and I think probably most came back. But also some stayed, and as I said, there was this kind of back and forth between Palestine and Egypt, throughout the late Ottoman period, even before that. So that's not so surprising.
Yair, I don't think we have many more questions. We have a lot of people thanking you for your lecture and expressing the desire to read your book. And I think someone wants. There's also a request for your email address. We can, you can share that afterwards. So I want to thank you again, Yair, for an amazing lecture. And I want to thank our audience members for joining us today. The next JDC Archives program will take place on October 16. Simone Gigliotti will give a lecture on JDC's mobile film units in post-war Germany, and you will be able to sign up for it on our Facebook account, and I think on X as well nowadays. And we will be sending invitations in mid-October. Actually in a few weeks. Thank you, everyone. And thank you again, Yair.
Thank you very much.